All right. Who's ready to build a REST API?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Let me just pull up my my notes for this. So before we get into it, what is a REST API? Uh-huh.
It uses these particular methods, or I don't know if you call them methods, but these particular like architectural guides that are like Git and Post and Touch. That's different from SOAP. That's all I got.
Yeah. Oh, you're doing great. Anybody else want to add something in? Yeah, Debrina, that's a great start. So representative state transfer. I think is what it is. Representational state transfer. Thank you. Yeah, so REST APIs. REST is this architectural style. It's kind of a standard, but not exactly a standard. And what you were gesturing to, so REST is all about 4 different operations, which are CRUD. CRUD is the acronym. That's create, read, update, and delete. And for the visual learners, I'm going to put this in some notes here. So CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. Those are the 4 things that you're doing to the API. And you perform those 4 operations using the HTTP methods, right? So that's the distinction. We've got get, post, put, delete, patch, head, all of these different HTTP methods. And there's not exactly a one-to-one correspondence between the two. So if you wanted to read, you would use get. That's really what makes the most sense. But if you're going to create, you could create with a post request, or you could create with a put request, right? And a lot of the questions about whether you would do that with a put request or a post request are ultimately up to the developers. They're ultimately up to you. And that's why creating a REST API is such an interesting thing, because there's kind of an art to making a really good API that people love to work with. And some choices that you make might make it hard to work with, you know, kind of a pain to work with.
From security, what else would you consider in ways to be using like Git and Post?
Say more about that question.
To create information, to create.
Yeah, so it's a great question. We can get into this a little bit more later. But so the HTTP methods that you'll probably be using are get, post, put, maybe delete. Say that again? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, depending on what you're doing, what you're wanting your users to do, so the Google Contacts API, right? The Google Contacts API is almost certainly going to expose some sort of route to allow you to delete one of your contacts, right? And so it would be something like /contacts/ the contact ID, and you'd make a delete request to that in order to get rid of that contact. Does that make sense?
And even with delete, we still have a choice of like saying delete just means move this to this other database, right? Like
to the trash or whatever. Yeah.
Or if we want to, like, I know like when we think we're deleting something on Facebook, we're really not deleting it. It's just getting put in a separate table.
Uh-huh.
in my
like
opinion.
a table of
Like
deleted.
nothing you've ever done is actually deleted. It's just like not in the public eye.
Yeah, yeah. So the HTTP methods are like, we use these, and we use them in a particular way because it's kind of a standard. People are familiar with it. Like you want to create an API that people are going to be able to understand relatively quickly, and so that's why we would use these methods for the things that we're going to use them for. And you're absolutely right. On the back end, you can implement that route however you want. So delete doesn't have to mean it deletes it from the database. It could mean I add a little flag to a field in the database that says this is deleted, if there's some reason that you might want to keep tracking the thing.
I've honestly never used flip or delete to update or delete. I've like used get to delete, getting the ID of like a to-do item, and deleting that way, which I don't even think it's the safest way to do it. So I'm really excited about using delete. Yeah.
Yeah. So Debrina, you asked this question about get and post. Oh, post and put. Yeah. So there's a difference between these two, and it's a kind of wonky difference. But once you understand it, it will click. Yeah. Idempotency.
Yeah.
Yeah. You get the prize for the day for knowing the kind of wonky vocab word. Yeah. So we'll get more into this a little bit later when we have a little bit more context for what we're talking about. But in the HTTP spec, they say that put is an idempotent operation. And what that means is if you run the same query twice, it should, or if you run a query, it should always produce the same result, right? So for example, what this means, kind of translating into practical terms, is if you're using put to update an object, which you can do, the person that's using the API needs to send along all of the fields that are in that object. So the name, the first name, last name, username, email address, whatever it is, they need to send that all with the put request, because whatever goes with that put request is going to be what lands on the server, what is created on the server, or updated on the server rather. If you were to only make a put request and like only include the email, for example, according to the HTTP spec and how we interpret it with APIs, your user then would have no fields except for that email field, right? Because the idea, what idempotency means is if you take, if you make a put request, everything that you're sending becomes that new thing, right? You can't update just one field by sending just like an email. And I'm getting some kind of like crinkled foreheads. So we'll get more into this when we actually are building the API. So don't worry too much about this, but just know that there's a difference between post and put, because post is not idempotent. And so with post, you could update an object, and all you would have to send is the one field that you want to update. So we'll get into this in a minute. What do we use a REST API for?
We can use it to expose our data to others so they can connect to our API and get some information from us.
Yeah, that was a textbook answer. We can use it to expose our data to others, right? We're creating an interface for others to interact with our data, and we get to decide how they do that. We might say, we might create an API where they can delete contacts, or we could create an API where they can just get contacts. It's all up to us, and what we're doing is creating an interface for people to interact with their data. What's a use case where you suspect that someone is using a REST API. Say more about that.
API, send over some parameters, and information. I don't know what else I'm going to say. I think they're using REST API.
Yeah, so I think that one way to look at it is a lot of the apps that we use and a lot of the well, I'll stick with apps. So like you have an app on your phone that's the Facebook app, okay? The Facebook app is, even though it's created by Facebook, so it's kind of all in-house, what it's almost certainly doing is when you open up that app and you open up to the news feed, your app makes a request to Facebook's API and says, get me all the newsfeed entries for user 5389271, whatever your user ID is. It gets back a list of all of those stories with the title and who posted it and the time and all of that. And then it uses that to display in your app the newsfeed, right? So in that case, Facebook is using an API to expose data to an app that is then, it's kind of seamless. You use the Facebook app and you think like it's just Facebook. That's just what it is. It's Facebook. You're on Facebook. But really, what that app is an app running on your phone, and it's making requests to the Facebook server to get the information that you're seeing.
I got you. I misunderstood the question.
Sure.
I gave an example. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna kick you out, Theo.
Are mapping applications, like the applications that we use, like Waze, are they using APIs or REST APIs?
Quite likely. It's possible that some of these apps for some things are using sockets. So like they're creating a kind of persistent socket connection, and that's a different thing that we could talk about at a different time. But for things like news readers and if you go on the App Store, at least on an iPhone, you can find some GitHub clients, and I'm pretty sure that those are like just projects that someone worked on because they were like, I want to build an app that uses the GitHub API, and so then you have this app on your phone that uses the GitHub API. But what they were doing is creating an interface, a graphic interface on the phone that talks to GitHub's API. We're good on that so far? Kind of use cases, what we're talking about here. So another use case is if you were building a full stack app, so full stack meaning front end and back end. If you're creating a full stack app, you're going to want to create an API on the back end that your front end interacts with. Is this making sense? So if you have a to-do list that's in a database, right? To-do list in a database, you will have a front end that's there to display tasks. And you've worked on the HTML and CSS to create a nice, pretty list of tasks. But you don't have any of those tasks yet. You need to go to the database to get them. And so you go to an API that you've created, and you go to a route that's like /tasks. And /tasks gives you back a list of all the tasks. And so when you go to that route, you can get that, and then you can display it in your browser. That would be a full stack app. Cool?
So it's kind of like, I know sometimes when I try to sign into like the Learner's Guild program, you have to sign in, and it's signed in with your GitHub account. Is that we're using the GitHub API for authentication to the Learner's Guild?
Yeah, so that would be using, I'm assuming that's using some sort of OAuth, which is an authentication protocol.
So it's not an API.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how it's implemented on the back end.
Our APIs are just our route, like the URL to
Yes. And to build a REST API, you want those routes to do certain things. Like REST is a kind of model for how your API should look, some rules and some guidelines, right? So not, I mean, you could create an Express server that had some routes that wasn't a REST API because it's, you know, maybe it's serving up some web pages or something like that, or maybe it's just sending back a simple response when you send something. It's not really REST. Like when you're creating a REST API, you're thinking about what are the resources that I want to expose, that I want to make available, and how am I going to make them available? What operations can people do on them, right? So that's the distinction, is when you're making a REST API, you're thinking kind of systematically about those questions.
Can I ask a question just from our
community?
So a REST API is basically, we're going to create it. It's going to end up being a page that is interactive with the user, not just dealing with the server, but we're actually rendering a user side that can be interactive with, and that makes it, and that's a REST API.
I'm not sure if that's it. And what might clarify this is, let's look at a real REST API. So I pulled up. So if you search Google for GitHub API, you will get a link here to GitHub's API. So if you were building a client, a GitHub client for your phone, like an app, or if you were building something for the computer, like an app, this is what you would use to interact with GitHub, so that you could figure out what the users are and what repositories they have and how many stars those repositories have, right? And so if we look down here, it says all requests to HTTPS, so this is using secure HTTP, /api.github.com are going to go to the API. So that's the kind of starting point. And they say this thing about we encourage you to explicitly request the version of the API in the headers. So they're saying, send along with the headers which version of our API you want to use. And it can be pretty straightforward to use. So say we want to get a list of all of Debrina's repositories. Okay, let's go over here to repositories and see what they say about how to access them. Okay, so list your repositories. So that would be if I was logged in and I was listing my repositories. List user repositories. So if we want to list the repositories for a particular user, it's saying use a get method and do it at this route. And this looks familiar, right? The colon with the username. That's the same way that you indicated in Express. So we go to /users/ whatever the username is, /repos with a GET request. We should get a response that contains the list of the repos. And it says, GitHub says, I think on that first page, all responses are in JSON. So we know to expect JSON. So let's try it out. So here we are, postman, https api.github.com / what was it? Users?
Users / username.
Yeah. So Debrina, what's your
TEQNICKELS?
ELS. Technicals, rad. / repos.
My rap name.
And fingers crossed. Here we go.
That's your rap name.
Okay, so here we go. Whoa, we got a 200. Okay, status 200. Let's see what we got. So I hope you don't have any like super embarrassing repos.
Just that one time.
So we've got an array back because we know that because of the bracket. And then the first element in the array is an object. And that object has these keys and values. So there's a repo. Its name is 321 contacts. The full name of that repo is Debrina's username plus 321 contacts. The ID for that repo is this, and oftentimes you'll need to know the ID of something to access the thing. So we can go to that in a second. But here's the followers URL. Here's the HTML URL.
It's like people following the repo.
Yeah. So if there was someone following the repo, and I think you by default follow the repo. We could go to this route. So what it's saying, one of the things that you can do in an API that is oftentimes very handy for people is include links to other routes that they might want to access. So we just got a list of Debrina's repos, but GitHub is kind of anticipating that we might actually want to know a little bit more about this repo, like who are the followers? And if we want to know who the followers are, I'm guessing we just go to this route. So I'll open up a new tab here. Just go to this route. So followers, let me try copying it this way. Yeah, I'll take that sucker out. So API, GitHub, users, technicals, followers. So this would be followers for Debrina in general, right? Because we're not accessing a specific repo. So let's see what we get. 200, okay. You got some followers. All right, it's an array. First object is dev, that's great. And Diana, and right? So you're getting, these are the followers of the repo, or followers of Debrina's account. Let's see, just for fun, if we can figure out how to access the followers of the repo itself. What's that? Yeah, well, here.
You can use mine. I'm following nobody.
Do you want to use yours? What's your
S-I-L-E-N-T-S-O-U-N.
say it again?
Silent sound with a Z at the end, like zebra.
Like that? Cool. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Debrina. Cool. So we got some repos here named Biting Glider. I love these names that are the artifact. Yeah. So let's keep looking at what we got from Biting Glider. So this on line 6 here, this is saying here's some information about the owner of this repo, right? So the login username is this, their ID is this is where their avatar is. So I bet if we copy this, we would get your, whatever your icon is.
Oh, cool.
There it is. So you see what GitHub is doing here? They're saying, here's some information about the repos, but hey, you probably want to know some information about this owner. So here's some information, and then that's where we found this followers URL. So if you want to see this, this repo owner's followers, go to this this endpoint. But going down more about the, so I'm going to shrink this, more about the actual repo itself. So it's not private. This is the HTML URL to access it. So if you wanted to see the web page for it, not the API response for it, you would go to this URL. Is it a fork? No, it's not. Let's see. Stargazer's URL. I think that's what we're looking for if we're looking for who has starred this URL or this route. And just for fun, so I'm gonna go to this route. And okay, currently it's got no stars. It's okay. We still love you.
Thanks.
And I'm gonna start. So you've got 1 star, Stargazer. on your repo. So now let's see if we can see me show up in the stargazers. So here we go. So stargazers URL is this one. And let's see what we got. So it's an array, it sends back an object, and that object has me, Justin Haheim.
Is there a way to see if is there a category in this object to see if something is, I don't know if this is the right question, if something's open source to work on, or does that just mean it's public and someone can contribute?
Well, public things on repos, public repos on GitHub are kind of technically open source just by default because you're seeing the source. Now they might have a specific license. It might be an MIT license, which is very open. It might be a BSD license, which is very restrictive or more restrictive. Let's see. So we're looking at stargazers. Let's go back to that repo. What's that?
I thought I saw license. Oh, it's language.
Looking, created at, get URL, homepage, stargazers count. The count was 0 when we made this request. If we made this request again, it would be at least 1. I'm gonna keep that sucker starred. I love this. Has issues, true. Has projects, true. Forks, so no forks, no watchers. Yeah, so probably if you wanted to programmatically access the license for this repo, which my guess is there's actually not a license in here because we don't have you guys put licenses in your projects usually.
Yeah, we do.
Oh, well, I take that completely back.
So there's like default, it's IFC or something like that.
So if we wanted to programmatically access that, and when I say programmatically, that means not browsing through a web page, but using the kind of API, right? Application Programmer Interface. Probably what we would want to do is find out how we get a list of the files in the repo, look for a license file, and then open that up so we could actually access that.
And I asked because I was thinking with this API, essentially, someone could build like a full stack application program to help people find open source work that they can contribute to.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like you can use this API to get the information you need or something that is like heavily starred or I don't know, has a lot of contributors or collaborators or something like that. Yeah. If you can figure out like how to identify what is open source based on what the information that you get from the API, like you could build an open source social media thing or something.
We do it as a phase 2.
No.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you're already starting to see what you can do with an API like this. One of the strengths of this API and a lot of the good APIs that are out there is that it's relatively general. It's designed to be used for a whole bunch of purposes. You know, it's not, you know, this API isn't tailored specifically towards someone making an iPhone app, right? And I don't know exactly how that would look, but you can imagine like if the developers were thinking, well, the only people that are going to use this are iPhone developers, they would have like, you know, display the repos and, you know, get the information to display on the page and whatever. But this is just to say that it's generally a good idea to make your API as kind of multi-purpose, what's the word I want to use for this? Flexible. That you want to make it as flexible as possible because chances are someone is going to use your API for something that you didn't anticipate. You know, like you made the API for people who are accessing it from a web page, but then someone says, you know what, this information is so useful, I want to make a phone app for it. Or, I want to make a, Apple Watch widget for it or something like that. And so you just want to think about creating general resources and let the user of your API figure out how to actually use it.
Do the companies get paid sometimes for using APIs? Like if I wanted industry-based information from users of Instagram, like could I say I want to pay for access to your users, intimate details on their profile to filter to find particular industries and build lists to sell to retailers or something like that?
Yeah. So my kind of hunch on that is that the right way to think of it is there are companies out there who will sell you data or sell you services or whatever it is, and you don't pay for access to the API specifically. It's like you pay for their service, and one aspect of their service is with your subscription you get to access their API, right? So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying, like, yes, there are probably a bajillion services out there that are providing information to subscribers to their service, and it's just that instead of like thinking about it as subscribing to the API, you're subscribing to their service, one of the offerings of which is an API that you can access. That makes sense? Yeah.
There are services like it's free if you make some certain number of requests a day. If more than that, then they will be charged.
Yeah, like Google Maps API, you can as just a kind of I think as an anonymous user, you can make a certain number of requests, but then it will limit you after that. And yeah, I wonder about, like, can you subscribe and pay for access so you can make 10 million requests a day or something like that? Yeah. So is this making sense so far? You getting an idea of what REST APIs really look like, why we use them? Yeah. Yeah. And so you notice we've been making only GET requests to get information. So we're reading information. That's in the CRUD, create, read, update, delete. We're reading information. I think if we wanted to, for example, create a new repo. So under my username, we could create a new repo. In order to do that, we would need to be authenticated as me. And I'm just going to kind of mention something about that, but we're not going to go into that. And you can understand why you'd want to be authenticated as me. You don't want anyone who has access to this API to be able to create repos for me, right? So you need to be authenticated, and the way that they say to do that is authentication. Yeah, so there are a couple different ways. It's this basic authentication, which looks like it's using maybe HTTP authentication. There's OAuth, which is this protocol that you'll use OAuth, I think, in phase 3, and it's definitely in the phase 4 repos that you'll be working with. And so there are a couple ways to do it, and based on our conversations from the other day about query parameters, URL parameters, and headers, you can see that there are different ways you can send the authentication information that GitHub needs to know that you are who you say you are. So you can get what's called an Oauth Token, which means you've authenticated yourself, and now you have this token that says this is who I am. And you can send it as a query parameter, right? So you go to a particular route, and if you know you need to be authenticated to access that route, you tag on that query parameter. But you can also put it in the header. So here it says sent in the header. So you would send in the header a key that's authorization, and then it would be, whatever the OAuth token is, right? In the header?
Yeah, in the header or in as a query parameter. Right?
What has you ask then?
I mean, it's a token that confirms you're you, right? I mean, I guess if I don't, I guess no one else is using this particular. I guess no one will have access to this particular, token. I suppose you'd be entering something where Auth will know. That's just your highlighting because you looked at them. Never mind. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I'm wondering like if is anyone else going to be using someone else's token, and can they have someone else's token?
Hope not.
Yeah. Okay. That's the thing. That's what I was asking. I guess.
Yeah, and there's more to get into about this, but also know that all our access to this is through HTTPS. And what that means is before anything is actually sent over, there's a secure, what's it called? A secure channel created between the client and the server, right? And so that prevents someone from like snooping your request and saying, I got their token and now I can create all sorts of repos, right? Yep.
I've heard people mention tokens before. I get that it's anything that identifies you, but actually it's an object.
Probably just a string of letters and numbers, or maybe just numbers.
Is the token a cookie, or is it different?
They're different things. Cookies could contain a token, but cookies are a thing that go in browsers to help create state in your interactions with a website. So tell me who knows about cookies? Who thinks they have a pretty okay understanding of what a cookie is?
We all kind of do.
Yeah, all kind of do. Okay, Stephanie, why don't you?
Well, I think of it in like frameworks, but I think of cookies as leaving it's like Hansel and Gretel leaving crumbs, and
Okay.
like leaving little bits of information so that if I leave, like when I get onto Facebook, I just hit facebook.com. My computer remembers there's cookies saved for like my login, my password. I don't have to log in each time.
Yep.
It just pulls up my homepage for me right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do a lot of trying to go to watching TV on a bootleg channel or something on my computer, and all these pop-ups would come up all the time. And I had to go and clean my cookies out because it would just create this freaking mess because of this website saving all these cookie crumbs that I did not want to leave.
Sure.
So I went and cleaned them all up. But I feel like it's just like you're just breaking off crumbs of information so that your computer recognizes you. These web pages recognize you when you go back to them.
Yeah.
It's like one of those sticky things you wear at networking events that says, "Hi, my name is,"
Huh.
and the person you're talking to is Dory all the time. Like they just don't have long-term memory,
Uh-huh.
so they have to see it every time they confirm who you are.
What a great analogy.
Yeah.
Say that again. So you are at a party.
Yeah, I'm at a party and I have a "Hi, my name is" technically, and Dory's on the other. I'm talking to Dory all the time, and Dory's like, "What? I don't know. Oh yeah, that's you." So they look at my name tag. They
It's like
put
bringing
my
the name tag all the time.
Yeah, it's like a name tag, and you have to wear it all the time because the server is Dory. Short-term memory is.
That's so great. And in the analogy, this person being Dory is a stand-in for how HTTP is stateless, right? You know, you've seen, like browsing around the web, you've seen the word session a lot.
Yeah.
Sessions are something that's created on top of HTTP, which is stateless. So meaning it doesn't remember anything from one thing to another, from one request to another. Sessions are created on top of that to give you the experience of, the server remembering you, right? And
Is a session just a cookie?
a session is kind of a handful of things. It likely uses cookies and some type of authentication, so it knows who you are. And but yeah, it would be managed through cookies.
So cookies isn't on the server. Cookies is on the browser.
Cookies are on the browser.
Yeah, they're not stored in the server.
sent from the server.
Sent from the server, but
Yeah.
stored on the browser.
Yeah, and so in this analogy, well, taking it out of the analogy for a second, you go to Facebook and you're not logged in. And then you log in. Facebook will give your browser, it will send you in, you click the submit button on the username and password, you click login. That goes to a route on Facebook's server that's like /login or whatever it is for them, whatever they decided. In their response, they're going to give you a cookie that says, all right, here is your token. And then for every following request that you make, your browser knows to take that cookie that you were given and give it back to the server. So it sends it in the headers of all the requests that you make. And that's how, when you make a request to / technicals, photos, whatever, it knows you're already logged in, it knows who you are, it knows what to show you, because you're sending this cookie back that says, hey, it's me, which is like the name tag, right? Hey, it's me. Cool.
Got 15 minutes till the server.
We've got 15 minutes. Oh, crap. I mean, it seems to me increasingly important that we come into this understanding the use cases and what the thing actually is before we start kind of hacking at it. So one of the fundamental things to understand about REST APIs is that they are exposing resources. They're oriented around resources. Could somebody ask Glenn David to? So a way that this is talked about often is nouns, not verbs. So your routes should be nouns, like people, places, things, not verbs like delete user.
Wait, what?
Let me write something out about this to just. So on GitHub, they made a route that was users, and if you just go to users, it's going to give you a list of users. I think just kind of general list of users. Yep. So this is just a list of users. How they determine who to give you, I'm not quite sure. Users is a noun. Users is a thing. The verb part of it comes in the HTTP method that you're choosing. So I want to get users.
And get is the verb.
Get is the verb, but your route here is made up of nouns. So you could say users, and then say you want to get a specific user like technicals, or what was your silent sound? Silent sound.
That's my rapper.
Yep. So again, this is another noun, and what you're saying is of the users, give me this specific one. The kind of technical term for this is a collection resource, a collection of things.
Yeah.
This is an instance resource, a single thing.
I found it very kind of enlightening that you said users is the route, and yet you distinguish the two, and I just always thought of the whole thing as the route.
Right. So they are distinct, right?
Yeah.
Get is the method, and starting from here, this is the route.
So yeah, so get, post, put, delete, those are methods.
Yes.
Available, made available to us through this REST argument, right?
Yep.
Okay, I just wanted to know.
And they're verbs.
Yeah.
Like in English, they're verbs, and so that's the way you distinguish. APIs will have the verbs that you can do, and then the things that you can do it to.
So that's why when building a full stack, the first thing you want to figure out all your verbs and all your nouns, because your nouns are going to be your routes, and your verbs are going to be.
Yep.
Yeah, close to it.
Yeah, and probably you're going to start with your nouns. Like, what are the things that I want to make available? And so, yeah, so on the GitHub API, So we've got repositories, and let's just see the nouns that they have. So users, you can put in a username, and then repos is another noun. That's another thing or collection of things. So when we go to this, what kind of, is this a collection instance, or is this a collection or an instance?
Collection.
It's a collection. What if we went to /repos /1239824? That would be an instance. Yep, that's the pattern to recognize.
Instance, collection, instance, collection, instance, collection.
Other way around. Collection, instance, collection, instance.
Collection,
Yeah,
collection.
I got it. So users is the collection, user name is the instance,
Yes.
and then repos is the collection, and then the repo ID would be
Yeah.
the instance.
Yep.
Almost like
So it's always collections.
Yeah, so if we went users and then silent sounds and then repos, or let's silent sounds and repos. So we got the list, we're gonna get the list of repos, and then let's look at this specific repo, because this is giving us some information about this repo, but it may not be all the information. And if you read the GitHub documentation, it says this. When it gives you a collection, it's giving you some information, but it may not be all the information that's available. So if we go to /8560, whatever, we haven't even looked at the API to know if this is exactly what the route is, but you can intuit that this would be an intuitive way to build the API. And so let's see if it works. Oh, no. So let's see why that happened. It might be that they want you to access the repo just directly. I'm going to try one thing here. It might be that they want you to access it just this way. No, not that either.
I've gone too far.
Oh, crap. So yeah, install public. Yeah. Yeah, so we could tool around with this. Repos owner, oh, and then just straight to repo. So you got the repo, you've got the owner, which is an instance, and then you don't have to do /repos because you don't want a list of their repos, you just want that specific repo. So silent sounds /. Oh man.
I think you take out the
Oh,
repos, right?
yeah.
Just the owner and the repos.
Yeah, the route is, repos, owner. Oh, I wonder if it's looking for the owner ID, not the actual username. Let's see. Yeah. Well, let's not spend any more time on this because I think people get the idea of it, right? Yeah? Cool. So yeah, let's do a little bit of code before we wrap up. We've got a few minutes. So we're going to go back to our trusty rusty Express server that we've been building. I'll make this a little bigger here. And what I want to show you is how to make a router. So this is, it's pretty straightforward, but this is a good way to organize your code when you have more than just like one or two routes. So let's make a router that's going to handle our API. And what we want to do is create a new folder, and we'll call this routes. There. Routes. And in our routes, we're going to create a new file called api.js. And in api.js, it's going to look similar to when we made the Express server itself, except we're not making the Express server, we're just creating a router. And so what that looks like is, and I never remember this off the top of my head, which is why I'm looking at my notes, const express equals require express. So we've got express. And then const router equals express dot capital router, which is a function we're calling. So this is creating an instance of the router. And then it'll look familiar. We do router.get, and it could be just that route, and then we have some callback that takes request and response and sends back howdy. Right? Yeah.
There's router as a capital R. Is it a convention that is vector that returns an object that's capitalized?
Yeah. Yep. That you're creating an object or instantiating an object. So const d equals new date, right? That's creating a new date object. Yep. So let me finish creating this route and show you how it integrates in. So then we want to export the router. Module.exports equals router. So we've created a router that's just this thing that handles some routes. And now in our server.js, we're going to require it. So const and then const, and we'll call this API router equals require. And then the path is routes /API. We could do api.js or just API. And so we've got a router that handles some routes, and now we just need to tell Express to use it. And how do we tell Express to use something? App.use. Now, what are we using it for? Let's use it for the API path. So a path or a route that starts with /API, and then everything after that will be handled by this router, which we just do like this. Cool? So this is a way to break your project into multiple files where you're defining some routes in one file and some routes in another file. Generally good practice to do this if you have more than just a couple routes. Questions?
Maybe I'm confusing the difference between API.js and the server.js, but in your server.js, you created app and set it to equal an instance of Express. And then in APIs, that router to equal something, yeah, Express.router. What's the difference between the instance of Express and the instance of router?
Who has a thought on?
It's a method. Routers are just a method of Express, but you have to declare, you have to call it.
Yeah, I mean the way to think of it is they're two different things. Express, when you do app equals Express, you're creating an instance of an Express server, which is everything that we know Express servers to be. It's a thing that when you do app.listen, you start it up and it takes in requests and all of that. A router is something specific to routes. Now, the interface, how we use it, router.get, is very similar to the Express server itself, which is intentional. They want to make it a very kind of familiar experience. But I'd be like 95% sure you can't call router.listen.
Okay. I see. Okay.
What's up?
I learned a cool trick that you can actually combine those two, the router and Express, in one line and require them both at the same time.
Oh, is it the, how do you do it?
It's just like const router equals require, and you invoke it with Express, and then after parentheses, you dot router with parentheses.
So you're saying like dot, yep. Yeah, so this would save you a line to do const router, because right now we don't need to access Express itself, right? Does that make sense?
Sort of, yeah.
So we're requiring Express, this is Express, and then instead of on another line doing express.router, we're just doing dot router to the thing we required.
It was cool, man.
Very cool. Thanks for bringing it up. So now, as we build out our app, this is where we're going to put all our routes for our API, and we could make sub routes from this. So we might have just a couple things in this, and then we might have a thing for tasks and a thing for calendar events and a thing for users and whatever the data is that we're exposing. We could have multiple files that define multiple sub parts of this route. Yep, and then we'll wrap up.
So on the app.js.
So in server.js.
Yeah, when you make the line 6 as you express, that express function creates a new instance of express. Right?
Correct.
How come that's not capitalized?
It could be. Like, there's no reason we couldn't do capital express and then express here. It's probably just a convention, just like people when they're making express servers just do it this way. In coding, you use conventions like capitalization and which type of case to use to communicate and to kind of signal things to people. But it's not a hard and fast rule. It doesn't have to be that way. And so as long as what you're doing is clear, you don't necessarily have to do one type of case versus another, right? And there may be some like more nuanced reason that Express does it this way, but I'm glad you caught that.
We just made a route to an API, and we made a route to Express API.
We're using Express to make a REST API.
So we're actually making a REST.
Yeah, we're gonna make next time, tomorrow, I guess, we'll make a REST API in here. So we get to take everything that we did today, learning about how REST APIs work, and actually start making it. And so I'll think between now and tomorrow about what kind of data we'll expose. So it'll be just a simple exercise. But then I'll lean on you guys to figure out which routes we should make and which URL parameters we're taking in, and all of that. Pretty cool?
Yeah, sounds cool.
All right.
Thanks again.